the cash register and the books are available individually. So one of the things I really love about Sonoma, and one of the things I was talking to Janet about, is that we have a really good crowd here. We have good readers, we have good people, and we have people who support each other. So I know many of you know Janet, and it's lovely that people come out and discover things about people that they've known for a long time. You know, that you never really know that somebody might be writing a book and then publishing the book, and then suddenly you have this window into their lives. And Becoming Mariella is such a special novel in that it's about growing and being yourself, but it's also about family and home and what does it mean. So in Sonoma, which has its own Italian roots, you can really think about what that means and how you can grow up. If you guys can give Janet a round of applause, she will be the one who will talk more about it. One very key thing. If you guys like the book, tell everybody you know and review it anywhere you can.
Well, first of all, thank you to readers for having me here. I feel really honored and blessed and excited to see the people that I love and who love me. So thank you so much for being here. And also, I want to mention that Pangloss, Eric and Marie Bradley, provided our wonderful wine for tonight, which is available only through the Mentoring Alliance, or it's available to it, but you can buy it online if you like it. It was delicious wine, and thank you both of you so much. Well, my plan is that I will read little segments through the book and talk a little bit about what I'm doing for about 20 minutes, and then I'll take questions from you guys. So I'm going to start at the beginning. Mariella gripped the scrub brush so tightly her fingernails dug into her palm. She kept her eyes down, avoiding her mother's dark, accusing gaze, and concentrated instead on one of the many chips in the old cast iron sink's enamel, a black scar in the shape of a crescent moon. A marriage to such power for us, for our family, Mama chanted in her sing-song voice, the one she used when she prayed or slipped over into what appeared to be a trance, which was at least 50 times a day. Oh Dio, who can believe, Mama intoned. La Familia Russo, so blessed. Only the saints can say why Matteo chose you, but at this Mama raised her eyes to the statue of Saint Agatha in the niche of the Russo kitchen and slammed a cleaver, whack, straight down onto the neck of the handsome russet-feathered chicken she held captive on the thick wooden butcher block. She threw the head into the nearby garbage bin and with the back of her arm swept the chicken onto the floor. The bird circled the kitchen, spraying blood, its red, fleshy waddle flopping as it ran, and bolted straight into Mariella's bare legs. There was a terrified and noisy flapping of wings, and a final squawk before the nerves in its spinal column gave way, and the headless creature collapsed at her feet. Aye, Mariella clenched her jaw and silently screamed. Chicken blood spattered her ankles and toes, her new tan leather sandals, the back of her calves, and the wooden kitchen cabinets, and seeped into the grout of the terracotta tiles on the floor. It was only a small amount of blood, but it spread like a bucketful. That does it, she inwardly fumed. She refused to give her mother the satisfaction of a reaction. Mama had engineered this beheading just to incite her daughter's revulsion. It was one of the conditions Mariella had insisted on, time and again. If her mother wanted her help in the kitchen, no slaughtering of chickens here. There was a washroom in the basement of the building with a big sink and a big workbench, perfect for chicken bleeding and plucking. Grazie, Madrona, grazie, Mama, acting all innocent and unaware, lifted her arms to Saint Agatha. She quickly bagged the chicken in plastic, leaving a few feathers and the blood behind on the tiles as she carried the chicken off to the basement for plucking. You knew I was breaking in these sandals for the beach, Mariella muttered under her breath. She wiped away a tear with the back of her hand. You know I can't afford another pair. And I wanted to give you a taste of Mama, because she's a very catalytic creature throughout the book. And she's, as the book goes on, and she's a big part of the reason that Mariella wants to escape. And she's also been not exactly in a betrothed in an arranged marriage, but it's a marriage that has so much pressure in it because Mama and Sicilian society and her fiance's family, who are very wealthy, everybody's pressuring her to get married. And she doesn't want to. But I also, the first time I ever met my Sicilian grandmother, I was 6 years old and went into the basement of her house in San Jose, California. And the first thing I saw was a chicken with its head chopped off. And that was my introduction to my Sicilian grandmother. So I had to put a headless chicken here. So, skipping forward, she's just graduated from college, and so has her fiance, Matteo. And they're at their graduation dinner. And Bruno Gambarini, who is Matteo's father, who's very wealthy, gets up and decides he's going to make a speech, to the graduates. And he says, "What is in our hearts, and we speak for our son when we say it's foremost in his heart too, is our joy for the day when you will become part of our family." At this, he nodded a sheepish apology to Mariella's mother and father, while Mariella's stomach churned in somersaults. Not only as a daughter-in-law, he went on, but as a vera filia. He paused once again, appearing happy and assured, as if what he was about to say was certain to please her. "Yes, as a true daughter, because when you are the beloved wife of our only son, we will welcome you even more than we already do as a loyal Gambarini and one of our very own." Guests waited silently for her response. Mama's loud, raspy voice was soared. What? What? Salvatore, what did he say? She belongs to us first. I don't believe my ears. Now Mama was on her feet. "Ascoltare, attenzione," she cried, waving her arms. A rapid, high-pitched giggle hit the air, and Mariella realized it was her own. "Bruno, Bruno," Mama said breathlessly, turning to Matteo's father as if they were in accord. "It's okay now to tell them. It's all right to tell them." Mariella's father sat with his head down. The fragile restraint on Mama's internal dam had broken, and Papa had no way now of stopping the torrent. Bruno Gambarini stood with his mouth agape, frozen in mid-speech. The others in the room no longer existed for Mariella. Mama, Papa, Matteo, now only animated blurs. Was she going to pass out? She fixed her gaze on Nona's eyes, her calm and steady regard an anchor. Mariella had hyperventilated before, but the foreign sound that came out of her now was the gagging a cat makes, its body heaving and convulsing before it vomits up a fur ball. Could it be that she could produce such a noise, this alien voice that seemed to have taken up residence in her? She downed a glass of water in nearly one gulp. After breathing deeply, she willed herself to stand. Matteo stood with her and attempted to hold onto her arm, but she pulled it away. He was shaking his head as if defeated, as if he'd always realized the inevitability of her moving beyond his grasp. "No," she whispered, barely audible, and speaking softly, only to him. "Why can't you understand? Why is everyone in such a hurry? I'm sorry, but I don't want to get married." She backed away from Matteo, from all of them. As she fled from the restaurant, it was only Nona's voice that reached her, a firm voice commanding Mariella's father. "Let her be, Salvatore. Let her go. She needs to be alone." And, in so many dysfunctional families, there's one person who's often the saving grace. And in Mariella's case, it's her grandmother, her beloved Nona. And that wasn't the case necessarily in my life, but I've had a dear friend in my life who kind of filled that role, Elizabeth. Some of you knew Elizabeth, and she fulfilled that for me, or she was that person who was there for me no matter what, as Nona is for Mariella. And she and Nona, Mariella, meet on the balcony after she's run away from this dinner, and her grandma is saying to her, Nona is saying to her, well, what are you going to do? And her grandmother had been the first she told about Mateo's proposal. I don't know, Nona. I guess Mama just had one of her fits. Mariella's and Olympia's word for their mother's tantrums. Worse than ever, right there at the table, yelling and screaming and pretending to pass out. By the time your father and Olympio helped her out of the restaurant, she was out flat, like she was on a stretcher. You know. Well, she does know. Olympio's her brother, her younger brother. Mariella is 21 when this book starts, and he's 18. But, so she and Nona are on the balcony, and they're talking and talking, and finally, after Mama comes out and has a real fit on the balcony, and Papa gets her back in bed finally, then she and Nona talk. After Papa and Olympio finally coaxed Mama to bed, Mariella and Nona lingered on the balcony and watched the morning rise. A thin band of light on the horizon cast a rosy glow on the red tiled roofs and buildings, reflected in window panes like flashes of gold. Buildings were crowded together, a patchwork of apartments, houses, Baroque monuments, and taller commercial structures, edifices ancient and modern, built of stone and plaster and lava rock from Mount Etna's slopes. So now there's only one thing you can do, Nona said after a time. You have to move to your San Francisco. What? Oh God, I can't do that. Mariella started to hyperventilate as she had earlier in the trattoria. She bent forward and held her head in her hands, trying to catch her breath. You can, Nona said, and you have to keep it secret because she nodded her head toward Mama and Papa's room. You know they'll find a way to stop you. Look at me, Nona said. Look at me. She urged Mariella upright and stroked her granddaughter's aching forehead. I've got some money, she whispered, and what else would I do with it? My sweet, beautiful granddaughter, if you want to do big things in the world, then you have to go to a bigger world. And if you remain here, they'll never leave you alone. So she does get help, but it's all secret, and she works at the trattoria. It's a trattoria. I called it a trattoria, but it's a trattoria. And she also works at a travel agency, and the travel agency owner also helps her to escape. She gets papers for her and helps put it all together. So she's got these two women really helping her to get out. And she's never flown. She's afraid of flying. So she takes Xanax and takes too much and you know, and is practically dead asleep by the time she reaches New Jersey. She gets to New Jersey and she thinks it's the most miserable place on the planet. And she's thinking, I left Sicily to come to this airport, and, you know, and I'm leaving again. But she goes on to San Francisco, and it gets even worse because this cab driver takes her to Richmond deliberately and tries to get more money from her. And she thinks her roommate's going to be a woman named Leslie. It didn't occur to her that he would be anything but a woman. But here she shows up with this cab driver, finally, on Lincoln Avenue in San Francisco. And this cab driver says, we're here, he said, and it had been at least an hour since they turned around, but it felt like 10, and now it was getting dark outside, 9 o'clock, and she was supposed to be at Leslie's at 6 or 7. She was still crying when she opened the taxi door. If you want your suitcase, you have to pay me, he said, with that bad look on his face, like he really did want to kill her. She thought of telling him he could keep her suitcase. $100, Armin said. That's the cab driver's name. The door swung open to the apartment building at 853 Lincoln, where she was supposed to live, like the old Victorian houses she'd seen on the computer at the travel agency. And there, at the foot of a gray marble stairway, stood a man. Or was he a boy? Tall, skinny, with bleached blonde hair standing straight up. He wore tight black jeans and a black t-shirt that said Giants in big orange letters. Did everybody here wear t-shirts with what she assumed were sports team names? because she'd encountered that at the airport in San Francisco too. The blonde man glanced at Mariella and then had her suitcase on the sidewalk. Mariella, he said, I'm Leslie. I've been watching for you. You were supposed to be here 3 hours ago. Madre mia. Leslie was supposed to be a woman, not a man. This was a crazy place. I am Mariella from Sicilia, she said. Are you going to pay me? Armin said. You deserve nothing, she answered, and talked very fast, explaining to Leslie, really to anyone else who might pass by and help her, what had happened. Italian all mixed up with English and how they ended up in Richmond. With the exception of the youth in baggy pants who zipped by on his skateboard, there were few passers-by. Only a handful of older Chinese women with string shopping bags hurrying along the sidewalk and keeping their heads down and giving Mariella a wide berth. At this hour, nearly 9 o'clock on a June night in Catania, when streaks of pink and yellow-orange lingered in the sky, the piazza and the sidewalks would be filled with townspeople out for a leisurely stroll, the evening passeggiata. Where were all the people in this renowned American city? Why were they all hiding behind closed doors? Cars along the boulevard kept moving. She will pay you $20 and nothing more, Leslie said, looking at the taxi license plate and saying it out loud while he punched the number into his phone. You deliberately tried to swindle her, and if you don't open that trunk and give her the suitcase, I'll call the cops, he said. You don't even deserve that much. So Armin stood on the pavement, staring Leslie down and refused to move. Okay, he said after a minute, and opened the trunk and threw out her suitcase. My valigia, she said. Your valigia, Leslie said, and watched as Mariella counted out the $20 for Armin. She wanted to spit in Armin Hofstadter's face. Armin waited, and then they go up the stairs, and she once again, and he grabs her suitcase and takes it up the stairs, and she once again says, my valigia. He said, my valigia. He says, your valigia, he said, echoing her again. He laughed good-natured, whatever that means. She regarded him as benignly as if she were asking for the time of day. Suitcase, she said. It means suitcase. And so she tells him, I'm going to call a taxi. I'm leaving. I'm not staying here. And he says, why not? You know? And she says, you didn't tell me that you were a man. And he says, well, is it because I'm gay? And she said, what do you think? You know, of course not. It's because you didn't give me a choice of whether I live with a man or a woman. And he says, well, you know, I should have said, but it didn't occur. I didn't want you to make the choice based on that. I wanted you to come just because I wanted you to come and like me. Well, they end up being the very best of friends and really like family, as you can imagine. And he gets her a job at a famous Italian restaurant, or a high-end Italian restaurant in North Beach. And when the first time she meets the boss, she's nervous. You know, she's still in love with Matteo. I mean, she loved Matteo, even though she didn't want to get married. She loved him, and he was a poet. He was very political. He was intense, and so she's still missing and loving him. But she gets introduced to the owner of the restaurant, who reminded her of Giovanni wasn't handsome like Jeremy Irons, Mariella's belated adolescent heartthrob she'd seen in an old video of Brideshead Revisited, in reruns of The French Lieutenant's Woman, or Marcello Mastroianni when he was younger. But good looking in the way of a man who was really a man, like the deceased actor the Italians called the one with the viso cesolato, Burt Lancaster. Giovanni was too old for her, of course. His dark brown hair gray at the temples, the laugh lines around his eyes placed him somewhere in his 40s, maybe even as old as her father. He looked at her directly, and she felt the unmistakable flash of desire between her legs. No, don't get up, Giovanni said, extending his hand, and then to Leslie before he sat. Good to see you again. And they have a glass of wine, and she's talking, and they're talking and getting to know each other, and she's very nervous. And finally, he says to her, I'm Giovanni Russo, the owner told her, as Pietro poured wine for them all. She laughed, too loud, she thought, and said, maybe you are my uncle. So that was the last thing she wanted, for him to think of her as his niece, or even worse, a silly girl. She found him way too attractive for that. All her life, her mother had warned her, someday you're going to put your big foot in your mouth and you won't be able to get it out. What I mean to say is, I am Russo like you, she said quietly, Mariella Russo. And so they talk some more, and so it's going back and forth, and he's telling her that his family moved from Liguria to England because he speaks with a little accent, which she can't quite place it. And she says, oh, that explains why you talk so good. She caught herself again. She wanted all of them to see the results of her years of high school and university English. No, she said, I mean speak so well. She met Giovanni's eyes with her own over the rim of her glass and tilted her glass toward her lips, but the wine never made it to her lips. Her hands stopped short and the wine dribbled down the front of her dress. She grabbed her white linen napkin from the table and dabbed at her chest, then dunked a corner of the cloth into her water glass and rubbed at the purple splotches dead center on her left breast. Verda, the lace of her rose-colored bra showed clearly through the dampness. She tried to console herself with the thought that she was not herself because she was still exhausted, and maybe the Xanax hadn't completely worn off. Well, so the interview, they go home. She and Leslie go back to the apartment, and she's sure she won't get hired, but she does. And he falls in love with her, and they start, I mean, this takes a while. It's not the first day on the job, but after a few months, and he falls for her. His wife has died of breast cancer, and it was not a good marriage, and he's just enlivened by this young woman, and she's not in love with him. But she enjoys his company. They have dinners, they have a sexual relationship, but it's not the love of her life, and she ends up kind of breaking his heart. But it ends up feeling to her like the same thing follows her wherever she goes. People want more of her than she wants to give. And that's kind of her quest, is how does she find independence and her own path to follow and maintain connection. She hasn't figured that one out. How do you be yourself? How do you have independence and have a connection to? And she meets also, she has a flirtation, but not an affair, with one of the waiters at the restaurant, Bernard, who's getting a degree in English and wants to become a writer. There always has to be a writer, you know. And they have a big dance scene, and Mama shows up in the middle of all of it at one point, tries to drag her back home, and makes a suicide attempt, which is pretty phony, but I mean phony in the sense that it's very dramatic, just like Mama. She takes a bottle of pills and announces, she's staying at Giovanni's apartment while Mariella is staying at her own apartment with Leslie, and she announces to Giovanni, I'm going to kill myself. And she goes in the other room and locks the door and takes these pills, and of course he can get it. Giovanni gets in the room, and she has to go into the hospital, and she says, well, when I get out of here, I'm still going to kill myself, you know. But finally she goes back home, and then as the book progresses, turns out her brother Olimpio is going to marry the sister of Matteo, her old fiance. So she has to go back to Sicily, and that's kind of where I think I'll leave it. She meets back up again with Nona, and she stays at her Nona's apartment. Nona has moved out at this point from living with Mariella's mother and father. She's the mother of Mariella's father. She's Salvatore's mother. And so she and Leslie stay with Nona. And so I'm not going to give away the ending of the book, but she does meet up with her old boss from the Trattoria. And Leslie, in the meantime, has a love affair, and he gets treated very poorly by his lover, who has lied to him. Leslie has money, and he's a law student, and his lover is just using him for his money, and that bonds him and Mariella even more closely because they really take care of each other through all these trials and tribulations. But when she goes and meets and has dinner with her old boss, and so she has this conversation with him, and she says, I can't imagine that, she said, she's talking about marriage and relationship. I only see people swallowed by other people. She thought of Mama's manipulations and Papa's loyalty, Giovanni's sad married to Beth, and now her brother's inevitable engulfment by the Gambarinis. Even Bernard's struggle to free himself from Carmen, an unwarranted sense of responsibility and guilt keeping him in place. Even though she understood, the charge between her and Bernard would rekindle if they tried to be friends. She'd been saddened by the finality of their connection. They'd hardly spoken since their night at Club Estilo, when they went dancing on her birthday. As though mutually silently they'd agreed to behave as if they'd barely met. But that's it, isn't it, she said now, the impossible task of being connected and living a full separate existence at the same time, of being able to be wholly oneself. And I'll stop there. Thank you all so much. It wasn't nearly as scary as I thought. So I'm open for questions or comments or whatever you might have on your minds.
So, how much do these characters reflect your own family?
Well, I think Lenore is probably the only one here who ever knew my mother. And while my mother was not a replica, or I would say a replica here, my mother had a really dramatic flair, and she was envious, as Mariella's mother is. So she's a prototype, but my mother was Irish and this woman's Italian.
Oh, well, that's a different thing
It's-
altogether.
But yes, I think the inspiration was the overbearing mother prototype. Maureen.
So I'm wondering, Janet, if we can hopefully have a follow-up novel? Are you thinking about that? I mean, you have almost get through tonight, and then you could start. Right?
I can start. Well, you know, someone asked me that, and I realized that as I was writing this novel, I would write long character sketches of each of the characters and give them all their own history. I have a Nona section, I have a Mama section. Giovanni has a sister named Teresa who was in a convent. I have a section for her. And so I've thought about, you know, what would it be like? I have a Leslie section, you know, so what would it be like to write a novel with all the same characters but from different perspectives? And then somebody else suggested, how about writing Mariella's cookbook? She loves to cook. I left out, there's a lot of food in this novel, and a lot of Italian cooking. And so I even bought some copies of Mariella's Sunday ragu, if anybody, and Nona's meatballs. So I have a few copies of those if anybody wants them. Yes. Hey, Karen.
Hi. Did you have a special feeling about this book? I know you've worked on other things. Was this special for you?
You mean
Did you
this?
think it was gonna maybe click?
In other words, what made this book happen
Right.
more than the other ones?
Right.
That's a really good question. A friend asked me, someone asked me, a fellow writer, well, if you could write about anything that you wanted to write about, what would it be? And I immediately thought of Sicily, but I hadn't thought of the story, but I just knew I wanted it in Sicily. And so I think that's really what caught me. I didn't know what I wanted to have happen in Sicily, but I took it from there. And my career has been as a psychotherapist, so my writing has been something that I've fitted in between working and went for an M.F.A. in the middle of all of it, as you know. And part of what has really motivated me as a therapist and as a human being is for people to find their own way. And so I kind of knew that that had to be in the story. So I think that's really what motivated me. Plus the feeling of kinship, I guess, with Sicily. I stayed with relatives there. Larry and I visited together, but I also stayed there as a young person. So, and I have a real cousin named Olympio and Mariella. And Olympio has a grappa factory, a distillery in Piemonte, so I'd like to get over there one day. Irv.
So it's just so San Francisco and kind of tales of the city that Mariella would end up with a gay Leslie roommate. I'm just wondering what your inspiration was for that.
That's a really good question. I think that's a really good question, you know, and some of the people I've loved most of my life are gay men, as I do now. And so those friendships are very tender and close for me. And I think that's really, you know, I think I didn't want it to be a woman. I don't know why, but I just felt like it would be a special bond because they both have a history of being betrayed in some way. Mariella by her mother, I mean, who's trying to fit her into certain things, and Leslie too. And so they really have an understanding that draws them together, I think. Yeah, and he tells her, and his lover actually had AIDS and didn't tell him, and so she goes with him for testing and gets him through it, and he's fine, but it really bonds them together. And that, you know, what they both had to endure and get through, I think, is what really brings them close. So, yeah, she loves him very much, and he her. Jane.
Well, I so enjoyed reading it, the novel. I really got caught up in the story. And what a remarkable young woman she was, despite the fact that she had such a mother who tried to take her apart. But the characters were strongly drawn, and you know, I felt like I got to know them as the people living in this book, in this story. And I was wondering about how, you know, did they live in your head? I wonder about the creation of a novel. Like, how did the story unfold in your?
Yeah.
How did it happen? Did it just grow? You know, as you started, and
Yes.
Were they talking to each other? These characters?
Boy, that's a great question. 'Cause, you know, I think the process of that is different for everybody who writes. I didn't have a cast of characters in mind. I mean, once I got Mariella in my mind, you know, Mama was right on her heels. And so the characters kind of, I guess, grew organically. And there were some characters that I delved into that I ended up not delving into, that maybe got some mention, but didn't really blossom. For me, it was a process of letting, it sounds corny, but letting the characters speak for themselves and letting them grow and emerge. And if I wasn't being authentic, I knew it. Then I had to back out and start over. A lot of writers will outline, you know, I don't do that. I mean, I write it as it comes, and a lot of editing, but does that answer what you were saying?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I guess the best word is it grew organically. Bill.
First of all, you speak really eloquently. And
Really?
Yeah, really. As you're talking, it's completely absorbed. in
You're
what
very
saying.
dear to say that. I feel like a croaky old lady.
Close. But it actually brought up a lot of visual images for me. And I kept thinking, no, I shouldn't say, a screenplay or, you know, a movie.
I would love it if it was ever made into a screenplay. I wouldn't have any idea
Is there
about
a screenwriter in
Hollywood producer. Yeah, no, I think it would make a great movie, but I have no idea how to make that happen. I've got a great PR person. Maybe she'll know something.
Who would play Mariella?
Oh.
Well, Mariella's short. She's 5'2", and she's got a gap in her front teeth, and she's got green eyes and curly dark hair. So there's a young Latina woman who I can't think of her name right now, but I think she'd be a great Yes.
How long were you writing before you knew what was gonna happen?
How do you mean?
Well, before you knew how the book was gonna end, or how it was gonna get resolved.
How long was I
Well, I mean,
writing?
just, yeah, like, what part of the process, did you know that in the beginning, or did you kind of just learn that as you went along and let her?
Both. It's interesting because what I knew almost before I wrote the whole book was the last line. And you know, and I would say to myself, just put that line away because it may not turn out that way, but it stayed. And I don't think I knew what was gonna happen between her and Mateo at the end. You'll find out. If you read the book, you'll find out. But is that what you were asking?
Yeah, it was, and I just read the last line, I won't.
Don't tell it.
But I was also thinking that in a way, this was like a dream.
Like a dream.
I mean, the way that you were describing how they came to life, you know, and how they grew and developed, it has a dreamlike quality to it.
Oh, okay.
The way you wrote it had a dreamlike quality
Thank you.
to it.
I like that. Yes.
I have a dog in case I can't talk super loud, but I was just wondering, it seems like there was a theme of like having independence and also connection, and I was wondering if that is something that you were like wanting the answer in the book, or if it's something you have an answer to.
I didn't hear the first part, but
Oh, the themes of connection and keeping independence, if
Yes.
it was a question you were grappling with while you were writing it, or if it's something you like had the answer to that you wanted to express in the characters.
mostly through the characters. I think it's something I have grappled with. I mean, I think that's really why it drew on me, was for a lot of my own life, that is something I have grappled with, is how to have my own life and be in connection to And I do definitely feel that that's the case now, and has been for a number of years. And I'm in a relationship that allows that, where we live together as we have separate lives. But yes, it's a real question I've grappled with and worked with a lot with clients. So, yeah, it's a really seminal question for me. Joanne.
Well, I loved the book.
Thank you
And-
so much.
You know, when you talk about her quest to find her own independence, one of the things that really stood out for me about the book was how passionate she was. You know, and just how passionate about Sicily and growing in her love for San Francisco. But, you know, she's sexy and she loves food and she loves dance. And it was just a wonderful part of that. The whole sense of her trying to find herself included all parts of her. And I really appreciated that.
Oh, thank you so
I don't know
much.
if you want to say anything about that. But.
No, but I like it. I like that you think she's sexy. Thank you. Well. Oh, yeah, sure, Joey.
I was just wondering how you went about getting it published.
That's a very good question. I sent it out to a lot of agents, got a lot of rejections. I got one good bite, and she had me rewrite some things. I sent it back to her, and I was like, oh boy, I'm getting an agent. And then she told me she thought the book was too dark. And I must have sent it out 50 or so times. And in the meantime, my dear friend Sue got her book published through She Writes, and several other women I know got their book published through She Writes, which is a hybrid. You have to submit, and you get accepted or not accepted, and then they do the whole thing for you, and they do a beautiful job of it. Would you say that, Sue?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so it's a hybrid publisher, and that's how I got it published. And now our books are being distributed by Simon and Schuster, which is really great. The editor of She Writes managed to get that contract for us, so that's who sends the book out.
What do you mean by hybrid publisher?
Sue, what do you say?
Well, there's three ways at this point really to publish a book. I can't really see you. But the first way is you do everything yourself. You get your own cover designer, you get your own editor. I mean, it's a pain in the ass, but it can be done. And then the second way, or let's say that the best way, if you can, is you get an agent. They make a deal with Simon and Schuster or whomever, and you do nothing but collect a few royalties if you're lucky. And what we did is a hybrid publisher. It's not as good as having an agent and being published by one of the big 5 or 6 publishers. But what they do is they do everything for you, like a big publisher would. But they distribute it to the bookstores, but they do no publicity. Whereas if you go to a Random House, they'll give you a PR budget, and they'll say 10 or 50 or James Patterson, they'll probably give $1 million to help him publish the book, you know. But whereas a hybrid won't do that, but you pay the hybrid. We paid She Writes to publish the book. We ended up with a product, and we ended up with it being distributed in the various bookstores. And they get a royalty on every sale, and we get a royalty on every sale. So it's an in-between, it's a middle of the road.
Yeah,
It is interesting. I missed that. What'd you say?
I said it's the middle way.
Yeah, it is the middle.
And I managed to, through my publicist, I managed to get some really great reviews from Kirkus, from Book Life, from some of the instructors that I had in my M.F.K. program. And so, you know, I really have felt sheltered or herded through this process in a very nice way. And I did hire my publicist, and she's quite wonderful, and she's helped me a lot. I was actually on a podcast for NPR last Monday, which will be out sometime in March, and it's called A Novel Idea. Larry.
Yeah, so, as Janet's husband, I want to say that if you enjoy the book, please make a review.
Yeah.
It really will boost Janet's standing and make a big difference, so I make that please everybody.
Where do you make reviews? What's the
Yeah.
places to make reviews?
I'm not allowed to say.
Oh, okay.
There. No, you're not allowed. But, you know, there, you can figure it out. You'll
Oh, wow.
Well, I think what I'll do is make my way over to that table. Like I've been told I'm going to do that. And I'll see you there, and I'm happy to see you.